Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
One of the suspects in the poison attack on the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter has been revealed as a highly decorated senior officer in Russia's military intelligence unit called Colonel Anatoly Chapiga, according to the online investigation site Bellingcat. Their report claims that Chapiga was the man who travelled to Salisbury under the name Ruslan Boshirov. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has more.
2 weeks ago, the Salisbury poisoning suspects appeared on Russian television to claim they had been innocent tourists visiting the famous English cathedral.
Он знаменит своим шпилем 123-метровым. Он знаменит своими часами, самыми первыми часами, которые были изобретены в мире, которые до сих пор идут.
A week earlier, the police had published CCTV footage of the men in Salisbury, and it charged them with attempted murder. The police believed their names, Ruslan Boshirov and Alexander Petrov, were pseudonyms, while the Prime Minister accused them of working for Russian military intelligence, or the GRU.
The GRU is a highly disciplined organisation with a well-established chain of command. So this was not a rogue operation. It was almost certainly also approved outside the GRU, at a senior level of the Russian state.
Now the investigative website Bellingcat has provided the strongest evidence yet of state involvement. It claims Mr. Boshirov is really Colonel Anatoly Chapiga, aged 39, apparently a veteran of the war in Chechnya. It's believed this is him standing on the far right. It's also alleged he served in Ukraine and has been under GRU command for 17 years. The website claims Chapiga trained here at the prestigious Military Command Academy in Russia's Far East. It also says that he served in an elite special forces unit known as the Spetsnaz. And this academy's own alumni website has listed a Colonel Chapiga as being awarded a Hero of the Russian Federation only 4 years ago by President Putin's own decree. This was a similar ceremony 2 years ago for veterans of the war in Syria, though we don't know if President Putin gave Chapiga his medal personally. He usually does.
Что вы там делали?
British officials haven't confirmed that the man on the left here is a GRU colonel, though they certainly aren't denying it, and I understand that the true identities of both men are known. Not that this will help restore relations between Russia and the UK. The tensions over Salisbury all too evident in the UN Security Council this afternoon.
Russia has only sought to obfuscate through desperate fabrication. Permanent members of the UN Security Council must not attack and undermine the international non-proliferation regimes and the institutions that underpin them.
The question arises, if they do not want to cooperate, well, does this mean that they have something to hide? We call upon London once again to start a constructive dialogue in order to get to the truth.
British authorities are hoping today's claims will make it easier to build a case for new EU sanctions, but perhaps just as importantly, to convince any doubters that the men who poisoned the Skripals and who may have led to the death of Dawn Sturgis did so with Moscow's full knowledge.
Jonathan, what are your sources telling you?
Well, nobody in Whitehall I've spoken to is saying anything on the record because there is an ongoing police investigation, though one official said the mood was, quotes, upbeat. They're certainly not denying that one of these alleged suspects is a colonel in Russian military intelligence. For all we know, they may indeed have helped supply some of this information. I think hanging over this whole story has been this claim by the Prime Minister that the Russian state almost certainly ordered this attack. And that phrase almost certainly has always been hanging in the air. And I think any evidence that points to a GRU colonel with 17 years experience, serving in Chechnya and Ukraine and receiving a Medal of Honor from Vladimir Putin makes that connection between the Russian state and what happened in Salisbury that much closer and that much easier, I think, to make the case with our European allies for more sanctions to prevent attacks like this happening again.
Jonathan Rugman.
The real name of one of the men accused of the Salisbury nerve agent poisoning has been revealed. An investigation by the Bellingcat Group, parts of which have been shared with the BBC, claims that the man who called himself Ruslan Bashirov and said he was a tourist is in fact a colonel in Russian military intelligence. British officials say they will not comment on the investigation, but the BBC understands there is no dispute about the identification. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera has more.
Ruslan Bashirov, that's who this man said he was when he arrived in the UK in March. And this is him in a 2009 passport application. But this is who he's believed to really be, Anatoly Chapiga, a colonel in Russian military intelligence. That picture of Anatoly Chapiga is from a 2003 passport file. It was obtained along with other material by the investigative group Bellingcat. British officials say they won't comment on an ongoing investigation, although the BBC understands there's no dispute about this identification. So what do we know about Anatoly Chapiga? The passport application says he was born in 1978 and links him to the Russian military. He's thought to have served in Chechnya and was awarded the country's highest decoration, Hero of the Russian Federation, usually bestowed personally by President Putin. At some point it's believed he joined Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and rose to be a colonel, also adopting the identity of Ruslan Bashirov. Using that name, he and another man calling himself Alexander Petrov flew to Britain on March 2nd this year. On March 4th, CCTV captured them in Salisbury, heading in the direction of Sergei Skripal's house. Police believe this perfume bottle was used to smear Novichok nerve agent on his door handle. That led to Skripal and his daughter falling ill, and 3 months later to Dawn Sturgis dying after the perfume bottle was found. 2 weeks ago, they appeared on state-funded Russian TV, denying they were spies.
Вы на самом деле кто?
Мы на самом деле те, кого и показывали.
Руслан Баширов.
Александр Петров.
Это ваши настоящие имена?
Да.
Да, это наш настоящий имя.
Mr. President, nowhere
Today, speaking at the United Nations in New York, the Prime Minister restated the British position that these were two men acting on orders from above.
The United Kingdom has presented detailed evidence, clearly laid out in charges of attempted murder and the use and possession of a chemical weapon against two agents of the Russian state. Russia has only sought to obfuscate through desperate fabrication.
In response, Russia's foreign minister said there'd been an increase in what he called unsubstantiated rhetoric, and he said the UK was stubbornly avoiding a joint investigation. But with Ruslan Bashirov apparently identified as a decorated colonel, the Russian account of Salisbury is again being challenged, and the evidence that the attempt on Sergei Skripal's life was an intelligence operation authorised at the highest levels is growing. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
It is probably fair to say that next to no one believes the Russian men suspected of the Salisbury nerve agent poisoning were here as tourists keen to see the city's cathedral. But who exactly are they? An investigative website has now identified one as a much-decorated colonel in Russian military intelligence. Interesting in itself, but significant if true, because it would be the clearest evidence yet that the attack wasn't just some freelance operation, but was approved at the highest levels of the Russian government.
There's the famous Salisbury Cathedral, famous not only in Europe, but in the whole world. It's famous for its 123-meter spire.
He said he was a sports nutritionist on a sightseeing trip. Tonight he's exposed as a highly decorated colonel from Russia's military intelligence. A new image published this evening, it's apparently taken from his passport in 2003. By 2009, he was using the alias Ruslan Bashirov. But according to the website Bellingcat, his real name is Anatoly Chapiga, a colonel in Russia's intelligence service, the GRU. He was awarded the highest state award, the Hero of the Russian Federation, in 2014, an honor that's usually presented by President Putin personally. In Russia's Far East, this is the military school he's believed to have attended. Investigators say he graduated from here in 2001 and later played an important role in the Chechen War. The revelations were made as the Prime Minister addressed the United Nations. 2 seats away, Russia's foreign minister took note as she spoke. As far from the hall, the Kremlin's defense appeared to be crumbling.
The United Kingdom has presented detailed evidence, clearly laid out in charges of attempted murder and the use and possession of a chemical weapon against 2 agents of the Russian state. We have taken appropriate action with our allies, and we will continue to take the necessary steps to ensure our collective security.
Russia repeated its offer to assist British authorities.
If they do not want to cooperate, well, does this mean that they have something to hide? We call upon London once again to start a constructive dialogue in order to get to the truth.
206 days since the Skripals were poisoned. Today's news doesn't make justice any more likely, but it might help Britain build a case for tougher sanctions against Russia. Rohit Katru, News at 10.
Well, let's cross to the United Nations in New York and our correspondent, Angus Walker. Angus, slightly extraordinary watching Theresa May laying all that out next to Lavrov. I mean, lots of tough talk from her, but really in the end, nothing new in terms of action to back it up.
Well, yes, much of Theresa May's speech to the UN General Assembly was focused on the duty of nations to respond in the threat to the global rules-based system, international law and order. And in the last hour, she has had a meeting with President Trump, who chaired that Security Council meeting. They have discussed Russia there. And in her speech to the General Assembly, she continued her attack on Russia, saying Russia had flagrantly breached international norms with its reckless use of chemical weapons on the streets of Britain by Russian intelligence. And she went on to say that if barbarous acts and aggression, as she put it, remain unchecked, then dictators and terrorists will remain emboldened. And she cited the coordinated expulsion of intelligence agents in the wake of the Salisbury attack as an example of international coordinated responses to these attacks on rules-based systems. So the question is, as the trail of evidence gets closer and closer to the Kremlin, will there be united action from the United Nations? Clearly, it seemed as though that's what Theresa May was arguing for this afternoon here at the United Nations.
OK, Angus, thank you very much indeed.
The 2 men wanted in the UK for the Skripal poisonings insisted they were civilians on holiday visiting Salisbury. But today, the real identity of one of the men was revealed by the investigations team at Bellingcat. He's not, as he claimed, Ruslan Boshirov, a fitness instructor, but Colonel Anatoly Chapiga, a highly decorated Russian military intelligence officer. One of the Bellingcat journalists who unearthed this joins me now. He doesn't wish to reveal his true identity, so we're just going to hear his voice and use his pseudonym, Moritz Rakuzitsky. Good evening, Mr. Rakuzitsky. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, my pleasure.
Tell me, how did your investigations start and when did they start?
Well, it started the moment after the British police published photographs of the 2 suspects. It's something we do. We like challenges. We like things that start with only a little scrap of information. We've done it before, and we jumped on it immediately. It took about a month, and we were able to identify one of them. We believe we're going to identify conclusively the other person within the next week or 2.
Okay, to hear that you're going to identify the second one is really important. But first of all, this one, how did you go about it? Presumably, you went about it with contacts in Russia. You went about it with documents. What did you actually do?
We started in many different directions. Obviously, the first thing, the low-hanging fruit, is to hope to find any visual reverse search success hit, which is what we've been able to do with some proprietary software that we've developed, where we can search through social media based on a face match. That's what we tried. There was absolutely no matches, which typically happens with people that don't have a social profile. for whatever reason, which might be expected in this case, obviously. Then we started, as we call it, working inductively. We tried to identify where such a person, if the hypothesis that they were secret agents, which we were able to prove through identifying their fake passports, which was the first publication we did on the story.
Just want to come in on you there, because I'm very interested to know more about Colonel Anatoly Chepika, who is a much decorated colonel. He's been in Chechnya and so forth. I mean, the first thing to say is presumably they messed up very badly here. So, you know, that's the first thing to say. For somebody that's so senior in Russian intelligence, that was a very bad day for him, wasn't it?
It was a terrible day. Today has been probably the worst day of his life.
But tell me about his record, because you've been through all his records. You know what he did. You know how senior he is.
Yes. Well, we've identified him as decorated to the highest degree in Russia. He's got the award of Hero of the Russian Federation. It's an award that is handed out by Putin to, on average, 5 to 6 people per year, officers per year. There was a spike in 2014 because of the Ukrainian invasion, where he handed to about 13 to 40 people. But we're talking about single digits, usually, numbers of awardees. So this is somebody who did something outstanding in the eyes of Putin. And that somebody was sent on a mission to poison an ex-colleague.
And do you think that Alexander Petrov will be of a similar ilk?
No, we believe, based on the information we've gathered so far, is that he's a junior rank relative to Chepika. We think he's somebody who's at the captain level or a senior lieutenant level. We've talked to some sources in the Russian military who, on the condition of confidentiality, anonymity, told us that they're shocked by the fact that a colonel, and especially a decorated colonel, was sent to do what they consider a field job that is suitable for a captain. And this, in their opinion, suggested that the job was requested at the highest level, or at least the GRU management or the command was trying to please their boss, Putin. That's the only explanation they can come up with. We don't think the other person is of the same ilk.
Any idea where they both might be now?
Well, I hope they're fine and alive. We've had one previous example with somebody we outed, another GRU colonel who was one of the main suspects in the MH17 Downing investigation. We outed him in May. He was on assignment in Syria at that time. He was brought back immediately to Russia. And we like to joke that he's probably getting a job at one of the fast food chains at the moment, because he's completely outed. And the same thing happened today with Chepika. We think he's going to be probably allocated to teach class in one of the GRU schools.
Right. Maybe do that instructing after all. Thank you very much for joining us.
President Trump has accused China of seeking to interfere in November's US midterm elections to stop his party winning. In his first meeting as chair of the UN Security Council Assembly, he said Beijing wanted his Republican Party to lose because he was the first president to challenge it on trade. China strongly rejected the claims. Our New York correspondent Nick Bryant reports.
For the second day running, it was a case of America late rather than America first. The US president leaving world leaders waiting, defying the norms of diplomatic protocol. The UN Security Council is the closest thing in international diplomacy to a corporate boardroom. And today, Donald Trump was in the chair.
Thank you very much. The 8,362nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order.
He called this meeting to focus on Iran, but then took everyone by surprise with an extraordinary attack on China.
Regrettably, we found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming 2018 election, coming up in November, against my administration. They do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade. And we are winning on trade. we are winning at every level. We don't want them to meddle or interfere in our upcoming election.
The startled Chinese delegation held an emergency huddle.
I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of China.
And then delivered its impromptu response.
We did not and will not interfere in any country's domestic affairs. We refuse to accept any unwarranted accusations against China.
And what made this all the more remarkable was that President Trump made no criticism of Russia for its meddling in the 2016 election. President Putin will be delighted to hear that. A trade dispute between Washington and Beijing has been widened by Donald Trump to include a fight over election interference. And in a setting designed to ease international tensions, we've seen them intensify this week between the world's two most powerful nations. Nick Bryant, BBC News, at the UN.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump has heaped praise on Theresa May as they met for talks in New York. After the meeting, Mrs May said they had discussed their mutual desire for a big and ambitious UK-US free trade agreement after Brexit. The President described the Prime Minister as being very hard-working, a friend and doing a very, very good job.
Busy day in New York. World leaders still there for the second day of the UN General Assembly. President Trump has been chairing a session on non-proliferation. Let's go back to Kylie Morris. Kylie.
Yes, John, after that barnstorming speech yesterday that prompted moments of laughter in the General Assembly, President Trump was back today, as you say, to take up the gavel, having railed against globalism and very much the high church of globalism, the UN Security Council. He wielded the gavel to great effect. He made some new accusations against China, more of which we'll hear in a moment. But he also again defended his reasons for pulling the US out of the Iran deal. There was no laughter there, a great deal of criticism from other member states. In a moment, we'll hear from the State Department on exactly what President Trump was trying to achieve. But first, here's how the day progressed. In the grounds of UN Plaza, St. George vanquishes the dragon of nuclear war. En route, another self-styled dragon slayer. Yesterday, President Trump lashed out at globalism. Today, a state whose nuclear ambitions he says he's determined to thwart.
The Iranian regime exports violence, terror, and turmoil. A regime with this track record must never be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon.
He kept the other knights of the round table waiting. World leaders cooled their heels for 20 minutes while he chatted with Benjamin Netanyahu.
The Security Council is called to order.
But when he got the gavel, he was ready to continue where he left off yesterday, singling out his friends and enemies, including China, who he accused of interfering in the upcoming midterm elections in the US.
Coming up in November, against my administration. They do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade. And we are winning on trade.
He provided no evidence, but many in the room now are familiar with his hyperbole, accepting with a shrug that when the President of America speaks, he's speaking to America, not to them. Donald Trump's criticism of globalism would be more easily dismissed were it not for images like these. This is Yemen. It provides a daily lesson in how UN member states are failing to address the world's most urgent crisis. More than 8 million citizens, nearly a third of the population, don't know where their next meal will come from, caught in a conflict between the Saudi-led coalition and Houthis backed by Iran. David Miliband last week toured hospitals in Yemen.
It's a really serious situation that the UN is meeting here, but where is the all-night session to try and address the world's largest humanitarian crisis, where peace talks are in abeyance and where bombing and fighting is making the situation even worse?
Is it the UN or is it the nation states who make up the UN Security Council?
The UN is doing heroic work in Yemen. I was there with UN officials. They're brave, they're committed, but it's the member states who are divided and who weaken the UN.
We met two women, Fatima Al-Asra from Yemen and Raja Atali from Syria, in Manhattan on a peacemaking project, and asked them what they thought about the limits of international cooperation.
The international community, and especially the international actors and the regional actors who have a say in Syria, and they are in Syria already, they have to come together and they have to agree on moving ahead in the political process and in finding the political transition in Syria. You know, without political transition in Syria, there won't be a stability in Syria. Without stability in Syria, there won't be stability in the region. And the stabilization in the region is essential not only for Syria and the neighboring country, it's for the whole world.
Can the international system come to grips with what's going on in Yemen?
I think the international system needs to unify its message. And I think that's a very, perhaps a very ambitious goal, but it's very doable. I mean, we see somewhat unity in terms of what's going on in Syria. So having to unify its message, having to have some type of a blueprint in Yemen, and I think currently the focus is on short-term gains.
But longer-term solutions?
Absolutely. That is somewhat missing.
It seems whoever is delivering the message and whatever their motivation, there is a desperate need for the institution to do better. And that's not rhetoric, that's real. Now, earlier I spoke to Dr. Kieran Skinner from the State Department and began by asking her about those allegations that President Trump had made about China meddling in the US elections, the midterm elections coming very shortly. Did he have any evidence?
I don't know what evidence that the president has, but there is historic evidence of great powers in other states interfering in each other's elections.
Well, there is indeed. I mean, there is of Russia, of course, interfering in US elections.
Absolutely.
But it's a bold statement to make without evidence to back it up.
Well, I don't know if the UN Security Council meeting is the place to lay out a full brief on some of the claims that the president makes, but I do believe that he takes seriously his daily presidential brief. And from that is probably derived some of the claims that he's made at the UN Security Council today. There will be follow-up consultations on all of the dimensions of discussion that happened in that meeting. But it really was a meeting about counter-proliferation and how to establish an international regime that works. And there was a serious debate going on among the Security Council members about what such a regime would look like.
We'll move to Iran in a moment because obviously that was a major focus for him. But on that China point, I mean, we saw the Chinese delegate simply shrug when the president made this allegation. Yesterday there was laughter in the chamber when the president started laying out his achievements in quite a kind of hyperbolic way. I mean, what do you make of the way he's being received here? Are you troubled by the idea that people are laughing at the President of the United States?
I didn't get the sense that they were actually laughing at the President in the UN General Assembly. And I wasn't sure that that was even laughter. He does have a way of talking that really gives a kind of, a strong sense of his understanding of what he's accomplished. And there were some people, I was in an upper chamber, that were actually clapping, saying that in fact America has achieved a lot in the past 2 years. So I don't know if we can derive from that the noise around President Trump's speech. That in
you don't
fact
think it was a critique of him?
I didn't get that sense, and in fact I think the way that he started his speech, talking at a very high altitude about sovereignty and its role in the international system through nation states, I thought was pretty profound, and it was inclusive. And I left the speech thinking that his Make America Great movement was really an attempt to tell the international system that the nation state is the core unit of analysis in the world, and that when you combine interests and values of states, it's easier to negotiate and find peace and cooperation.
I mean, I think one of the big contradictions in his speech yesterday for me was that he said that sovereign states should respect one another, we shouldn't tell one another what to do. And then he went on to tell Germany it should stop buying energy from Russia. He went on to tell the Venezuelans they should get rid of their government and that all socialist countries should step away from socialism. It feels as though he might be someone who wants the power of being the US president, but he doesn't want the responsibility.
I didn't quite hear that when he talked. I think on the one hand, he did talk a lot about interests and values and justice. And that when states attempted
he talked about self-interest.
But he talked about the interests of states, or you can call it self-interest. But what I took away from that conversation was that he was suggesting to the Germans and others, really rigorously evaluate your national interests. And could it include being harsher on some countries and getting energy more independent from the Russians and so forth. That's what I was seeing happening in that conversation.
I mean, he's certainly been telling Iran to put its house in order. Today, he was very tough, saying, you know, why it's so important that Iran shouldn't get a nuclear weapon. But there was some irony in the room. I mean, he is the only person who has walked away from the deal that was designed to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It was something that President Macron talked about. He said that all UN members should stick behind this deal. That's what Iran is doing. How can the president justify this position?
Well, I think there are times in alliances that are durable, like the Western Alliance, where there are fundamental differences, and this is one of them. Remember, during the Reagan years, there was a fundamental difference in the alliance, and many argued around 1983 that the alliance would fall apart due to the Soviet gas pipeline deal, and the alliance quickly recovered. So I think on JCPOA, there is a conversation that's being had among those signatories and others that support it about what a durable counter-proliferation regime looks like.
So the difference is a strength, not a weakness. That's what
I think so, and I think it shows that the maturity of the democratic system, that you have differences that are fundamental. How can you have the world's most mature and fully functioning multi-ethnic democracy, the United States, not attempting, at sometimes with a little, you know, leaning forward, attempting to help push a conversation in a way that it thinks it's important.
Dr. Skinner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Kieran Skinner from the State Department. That's all from us in New York. Now it's back to John in the studio. John.
Kylie Morris, Matt.
Now, earlier I spoke to Natalie Tocci, a special advisor to the EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini. At the UN, she has outlined a plan to sidestep US sanctions on Iran. President Trump responded that anyone who failed to comply with sanctions would face what he called severe consequences. I began by asking Natalie Tocci if she thought the EU was intimidated by these threats.
I think that what he is essentially trying to do is basically sending the message, I am the strongest kid on the block in the international system. I don't particularly give a damn about breaking the system altogether. I want to extract as much benefit from the system. By the system, I mean the multilateral system. And I will do what it takes. Now, the European Union is not intimidated by this, but indeed it has, the genie's out of the bottle. It has indeed sparked a debate within the European Union, and not only in the European Union, about the broader notion of economic sovereignty.
Right. But are you helping this very precarious diplomatic situation by using words like bully, or describing as the big boy on the block throwing his weight around?
Frankly speaking, how else would you describe someone that is punishing a supposed friend and ally for complying with an agreement that he himself, well, not he himself, his government had signed and is in compliance with international law? So we are being punished for respecting international law. Now, if that's not bullying, I'm not quite sure what is in international relations.
So if you're an international company caught in the middle between this, in this fight between the United States and the European Union, and you want to do business in Iran, how can you protect that company? And if that company has to choose between making money in Iran and making money in the United States, I bet you they're going to choose America over business in Iran.
Indeed, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, and I think we shouldn't be selling the illusion that the type of measures that Europeans and others are putting in place, this is not necessarily going to solve the problem caused by the US violation of the JCPOA. But it does provide a fundamentally important signal, particularly to the Iranians, but not only to the Iranians, I think to the rest of the world, which is the fact that the Europeans will do what it takes in order to try and do as much as possible to save the deal.
One could argue that you are prepared to jeopardize a tricky relationship with the United States with your policy, make it potentially worse, for the sake of protecting a government that has enabled mass slaughter in Syria, amongst other things.
I think that this is I would approach it in a completely different way. What the European Union is doing is trying to do its utmost to protect and preserve the multilateral system and the rules-based international system enshrined in international law. Let's not forget that this is a story that goes way beyond Iran, way beyond non-proliferation, way beyond security in the Middle East. This is about multilateralism and the rules-based global order.
Would you say that President Trump, in your view, is now part of the problem and no longer part of the solution?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, to the extent that, and he said this very clearly. In his speech at the UN General Assembly yesterday, he said very clearly that he is against global governance. He is in favour of a world in which every state...
The international order as we know it is finished.
The international liberal order as we know it certainly has to change. We're living through a very profound period of transformation of power in the international system. The West will no longer hold all the cards in the international system.
OK, got to leave it there. Natalie Tocci, thank you very much indeed.